Hello, everyone. This is Carol Beckham sitting in for our president, Jennifer Danaker. She's feeling a little under the weather, so I think she'll probably be listening in, but she won't be commenting tonight. So thank you all for being here. We hope that you'll put this on your calendar for the fourth Monday every month because we always have a good speaker, and we hope you'll just get in the habit of joining us. Tonight's no exception. This month's virtual speaker series features Bryan Hager of our Carrollton Democracy Project. He's the founder. It's a nonprofit group whose goal is to encourage more responsive government by enabling the public to provide detailed feedback to our policymakers. He'll tell you a lot more about that, but it's a nonprofit grassroots group, and he'll tell you a lot about that. Bryan, are you there?
I am here.
Okay, I'm going to turn that over to you, and afterwards y'all just stay on for a minute for just an announcement or two, and then we'll be through.
Okay, thank you. I really appreciate the League of Women Voters inviting me to do this presentation. This is the first one I'm doing on this subject, and so you guys get to be my guinea pigs, I guess. I did prepare a PowerPoint presentation so that I can dump a lot of information on you, and that I hope you will appreciate it. I'm going to go through the first half of this fairly quickly and then slow down toward the end and try to let people ask questions and things. And so hopefully this is going to work. Everybody see the picture of Wendy at the farmer's market? Okay, so many of you know me as a local farmer, and I am that. I am half of Krager Hager Farm. We sell at Cotton Mill Farmers Market, and that is one of the many hats I wear in this community. There we go. So I have been involved in politics for a very long time, including running for office a couple of times, almost 2 decades ago. I was not successful. I was a little bit too liberal for this community, I guess, and including being involved in various civil rights issues, picking up with the Black Lives Matter protests 2 years ago. And the thing that has motivated me more than anything, along with the civil rights, has been environmental protection. And I've been doing that since I was a young adult. My father gave me a membership in the Sierra Club, and that got me started. And a large part of that comes from, I just enjoy being outside and experiencing nature, whether that's hiking or handling snakes. Now, some people would say snake handling is a good preparation for dealing with politicians, but I would say that is not being fair to the snakes. They don't typically bite you in the back unless you are really doing something horrible to them. So as a result of that interest in politics, earlier this year, couple of us were talking about what we could do to make things a little bit better. And we created a project that we call the Carrollton Democracy Project. This is from our webpage, and we'll have the link at the end of the meeting. Jamie and I got together and we're talking about what we could do to influence local politics and help good people get elected. And we started pulling some other people in on that. That's Jamie and I on the left. And Carol is a participant in this, along with Susan Colgate and Chris Onstus. Chris was a great addition. He is a retired psychology professor from UWG, and he runs our focus groups. And that is what we decided to see if we could do, because part of what was concerning us is we did not see people from small town and rural communities being represented on our in political discussions, whether that's Democrats in rural areas or just the general rural residents other than in certain stereotypes. And we decided that we were going to try to provide information to the political process from our rural areas by doing focus groups. And a focus group is just that. It is a group of people that you gather to have a focused discussion on some topic. Most focus groups that are done in this country are actually business oriented. They get people together to test out how they feel about a new product or a new marketing campaign. But we were trying to pull we decided to pull these together to have a discussion about certain issues. Key to a focus group is you have some ground rules that promote people being able to talk respectfully to each other. And one of the things that distinguishes the focus groups that we conduct over many of the ones, if you just Google focus groups, you'll get ones brought up. Many of those are run by political operatives or lawyers. And what they're doing is trying to see what gets people most angry. That is not what we're doing. We are trying to see what common ground is, and we're trying to explore how people feel and why they feel that way about certain things. And what's driving us is the increasing partisanship in this country, the partisan divides, where we are separating ourselves geographically between urban and rural areas. We are separating ourselves ethnically in many ways, and we're just not seeing the overlap that we have seen in the past between areas that are more evenly split. And we see the really horrible result that comes from this kind of partisanship divide, where we saw thousands of people descend on the US Capitol in January 2001 in order to promote their political tribe rather than their country. And it gets down to the very personal level where we're fighting with ourselves, it seems, in our families. And this partisan divide is really harming our country. And one of the things, for those of you who have been involved in politics for a while, whenever something comes up, something new, some issue, you always ask, people ask, where does that come from? And you have to ask, well, where does the money come from? And we see partisanship profiteers. This started back in the 80s with talk radio and people like Sean Hannity and Rush Limbaugh, who have really promoted a sort of grievance politics. And they were making a living off of it, and so they did more of it, and other people joined them, and it moved online with InfoWars, Alex Jones, and people like that. It's moved on to broadcast and cable with people like Tucker Carlson, and there are a few on the left, but they don't have anywhere near the audience that these people on the right have, promoting this kind of bitter partisanship. But it's not just people in the media. It's politicians. Marjorie Taylor Greene burst on the scene in 2020, and in her first 3 months in office as a freshman politician in 2021, she raked in $3 million in contributions. That's far more than would typically be spent on a congressional campaign. And she's raised over $10 million for her congressional reelection campaign. So the politicians have figured out how to monetize this form of extremism and partisanship. And it's going up and down the line. And it's also corporate. The Facebook and the rest of social media that is built on the attention model, where they're trying to get clicks. The way they get clicks is by getting people to follow through on certain things that basically either scare them or interest them. And we saw in the run-up to the 2016 election, the broad spread of political misinformation on Facebook. And we saw the same thing in the pandemic in 2020, where Facebook was a primary source and outlet for spreading misinformation, disinformation about the pandemic. And it's not just Facebook, this has happened across social media platforms. And it's part of their business model that they like to have people who are fearful clicking through, running down rabbit holes of misinformation because that keeps them online so they can sell more advertising. And of course, that advertising model also works for broadcast media. Many of you have heard the term, if it bleeds, it leads. And that is true for local media. I'm old enough to remember when Channel 11 in Atlanta tried to change that. This was almost 30 years ago, where they decided they were going to lead with a positive story. And their ratings went down, and they dropped this after about 6 months. Now, many of them close with a positive story, but most of them, it's either got to be about corruption, murder, or some crime to be a lead, or some catastrophe. And then there's structural partisanship. It's not just the people who are profiting from it. It's designed into our political system. And the League of Women Voters has been working on ending gerrymandering for years. And we see in Georgia an example of how this works. In the 2020, sorry about the typo there, in the 2020 presidential race, this state was basically evenly split. Joe Biden won by just 12,000 votes. It was essentially 49%, 49% for each of the major parties. And yet in our congressional districts, it's almost 2-to-1 Republican. And this is also true in our state Senate districts. And the way they do this is the party in power, the Republicans, pack a lot of Democrats into a few congressional districts. And if you look at the table on the right, you'll see these blue numbers at like plus 60% for Hank Johnson or plus 70% for Nikema Williams. That means in her district, according to presidential voting rolls, an average of 15% of people will vote Republican and 85% will vote Democrat. That's the 70% district. By packing a whole lot of Democrats in a few districts, they then make it possible for a similar number of Republicans to control a much larger number of districts. So at the end of this election cycle, we expect that the Democrats will have 5 congressional seats in Georgia, and the Republicans will have 9 out of the 14. And this is a bipartisan effort. New York and Illinois did the same thing for Democratic benefit. And the Republican-controlled states, and there are more Republican-controlled states than Democrats, have been very effective at imposing these kinds of gerrymanders on our political system. And when you impose on this kind of gerrymandering, partisan primaries, where the turnout of voters in a primary is never more than 30% and is typically more in the 10 to 15% range. Well, who turns out for the partisan primaries? The partisans, the people who are committed to those parties. And so those tend to be the more extreme voters, left or right. And so when you combine partisan primaries with gerrymandering, you create a situation where the extremists are getting elected to office rather than the people in the middle and the people who are trying to represent a broad swath of the electorate. And with our winner-take-all single-member districts, it creates this I win, you lose competition. So that's the part of this. And we've had this around for a long time, this kind of extreme partisanship. Enslavement of Africans across the Americas, North and South, was a part of this. And we saw this early on in the colonies. In 1680s, there was a major revolt in Virginia where Black and white indentured servants and freed slaves and servants rebelled and actually burned the capital of the colony in their demand that they be given access to land. Because that was part of the payment for being an indentured servant. This was very early, before the colonies had adopted the slave codes. Well, what did the plantation owners, the British plantation owners in this case, do in response to this? Did they try to democratize the process? No, they decided that it was very important to never have this kind of joint black, white, working class uprising again. So they adopted the slave codes, which specifically forbid black and white intermarriage, that promised white working class land while creating long-term in servitude for the Africans. And it set the pattern for how we can use partisanship to maintain power. And we saw this run up to the Civil War. If you look back at the census of 1860, only 25% of households in Georgia owned slaves. Why did the men in the other 75% of households, why were they willing to go to war, to kill and to die in order to protect the plantation slaveholder system? Because the plantation holders had promoted fear of the Africans becoming free and taking retribution on the whites. And this kind of fear-based polarization has been the standard. We saw it in Germany with raising fear of Jews, the Dixiecrats, the plantation owners after the Southern War for slavery, then went out and tried to use fear, intimidation, and violence to protect the Black Americans from voting. We saw it in the Rwanda genocide, a situation where the Hutus and the Tutsis were literally living side by side in their communities. And a radio talk show host, in his attempt to develop political power, started promoting antagonism between these groups and led to a mass genocide that may have killed as many as 1 million people. And that was just in the end of the last century. And then you see it with Viktor Orban in Hungary and politicians that we know of here in the United States. So we have these analogs to what happens with this bitter partisanship and extremism. And it's built on some key things. And we are exploring this because this becomes fundamental to what we're trying to do with our focus groups of how we break out of this cycle. One, you promote an in-group and an out-group. And this is real important to understand. It gets conflated with racism, but it is not the same thing. Racism is looking down on, thinking you're superior to a group rather than just different. And we saw this in the early part of the COVID epidemic, whereas news started to promulgate about how it was having a differential impact on African Americans. You saw many white Americans say, oh, that's hurting that group. It's not hurting my group. I don't have to worry about it. And we begin to see the growth of the resistance to taking actions to stop the spread of the COVID pandemic. We've seen it repeatedly in other things. Promoting threats. If people feel threatened, if they feel fearful, they stop being able to think rationally. They stop being able to think objectively about the issues, and you get the fight or flight response. And if they're anxious about things, whether it's their current finances or the future, you'll hear later about the broad-based fear for the future of this country. And when this anxiety happens, people retreat into their safe space. And another one that's very important that we saw the plantation owners use very effectively is social standing. The white working class, the tenant farmers and others knew they were second tier, but it made it more acceptable to be second tier if there was a third tier, somebody below them. And so by maintaining a lower tier below them, they were able to feel better about their position in society. And we saw this going into the desegregation battles, where Montgomery, when it was given the choice of desegregating its public pools and parks, chose to close them rather than admit Black and white children into the parks as equals, because that would break the social hierarchy. And it was a decade before they opened many of the parks, and they actually filled many of the pools in. And that's the extreme we see. And then starting in the 90s, we start to see something new. We start to see an attempt to undermine our civic institutions. We saw this with Newt Gingrich's effort to basically blow up Congress, the House of Representatives, in order to take it over. We've seen it in the most recent attacks on the FBI. If you can no longer trust the institutions to protect you, you start to look for a strong man who will do it for you. And we've seen it in the efforts to undermine relationships. And we see this in our personal lives. I know people who have gotten divorced over their political differences. And it's a very painful thing to watch. Many of us have family members that we can no longer spend time with because of these political differences. And as these relationships break down, our connections and our ability to overcome problems gets undermined. And I highlight these two because this, while the in-group, out-group, and promoting of threats has primarily been a right-wing tactic, the undermining of institutions and undermining of relationships has been something we're seeing both left and right. And it's something we all need to be very careful of how we talk about things. When we attack the courts, for instance, we hate what the Supreme Court has done. Well, we need to talk about individuals in the courts, not how the courts are bad. Otherwise, we end up playing into this dynamic. So the good news is that people are responding to this. They're taking things into their own hands. And in states where you have ballot initiative process, we're seeing people taking a stand and doing things like getting marijuana legalized. So you no longer have this as a means of criminalizing large sections of the population. Raising the minimum wage. 4 years ago, in the same election that elected DeSantis as governor of Florida, an even larger majority of Florida residents raised the minimum wage to eventually $15 an hour. Every state that has voted on expanding Medicaid has done it. Every state that has voted on creating independent redistricting commissions has done it. And we're now seeing more work on ranked choice voting. I'll talk about that more in a moment. Two great resources if people want to talk about or learn about middle ground positions that can pull people together on issues are thirdway.org and the Niskasen Center.org. I'll have these websites up at the end of the slideshow as well if you don't get them down. Overcoming structural partisanship. One of the keys, along with ending gerrymandering, is the ranked choice voting. And we're seeing a wonderful experiment going on this year in Alaska, where they have an open primary that will select 4 candidates. And this is up and down the ballot. And then they will have a general election where the candidates get to rank those 4 candidates, their first, second, third, or fourth choice. And the candidates that score that get the most first or second choice votes wins. And it'll be really interesting to see how that works out. Maine has already done this one full election cycle in 2020, and they're doing it again in 2022. And 7 states have some version of nonpartisan redistricting commissions, and several others have semi-independent or partisan redistricting commissions. You can find out much more at fairvote.org. Defunding the profiteers, that's a much harder thing in our current corporate and system, but we are seeing people using civil lawsuits to try to bring defamation cases against some of these folks promoting misinformation. A third one is structured listening. We saw the Community Foundation of Georgia promote a really wonderful example of this past winter with their table conversations. And I think it's real important for the people who want to understand how we can move to educate themselves. And I've listed 2 websites that do a great job looking at public opinion polling. 538 is my favorite go-to site to understanding what's going on. And the Research Center does a whole bunch of in-depth and polling. And then there have been a couple of great looks at our partisan divide. CNN did one in January of 2020. And I would encourage you. And then for those of you who are real political geeks and know who Frank Luntz is, he was one of the architects of the Republican political surge in the 90s and the aughts. Several years ago, he had a stroke. He almost died. And when he came back from that, it was like come to Jesus. He met God and realized the damage he had been doing to democracy. And over the last few years, he's been actually putting together focus groups to try to find common ground among people. And there is a wonderful interview with him from Frontline talking about what he learned and his new perspective on how political machines have been used to drive people apart. Yes, we all want to be part of a tribe, to be with people that we find common ground with, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we are going to be against the other tribes. The fight among tribes is something that is pushed down from the top, and this is something that Luntz has realized and he is now working against. So what we heard, that's the background, that is the environment that we're working in. And how do we deal with that? How do we overcome this? Well, we decided that we were going to look at 3 focus groups that are very important. One was a swing focus group, college-educated white women. This group has been strongly Republican, as most white voters have been in this country. And especially the Republican Party used to be the party of the business elites. And it still is that, but it's now making a surge in other areas. And white women went along with that. But starting under Bush and moving much faster under Trump, they've been getting more and more evenly split between Democrats and Republicans. So we wanted to understand that. What is it that's driving these concerns of white women? College students are the future. And young people in general. We actually wanted to do a Gen Z focus group, but it was harder to recruit non-college students. It's easier to find the college students, so we did that one first. But they are our future. And while they tend Democratic, they're not universally so. And in Georgia, in 2018 governor's rate, or in 2020, it was about 55-45 Democrats. So Georgia has been much among the under 30 crowd. So Georgia has been much more in the middle, the young people are. And then Black voters they vote at a lower rate, especially in the midterms. And they are a core group in the Democratic Alliance. And the key issue there is, will they turn out? Those people on this call know that in incredibly important, in a typical governor's race in Georgia, only 50% of voting age people turn out to vote. In the last election, gubernatorial election, it was up closer to 60%. But that still means that 40% of the voting eligible population are not voting. And that includes a lot of Black and Hispanic groups, people. So we decided to focus on these. We would have liked to have done more, but it took a lot longer to put these groups together than we planned. And so we got these completed. So what did we learn from listening? Well, first, let's talk about what is a focus group. You asked the questions, I mentioned that. We change who starts each question. And with the white women, this is a very brief overview. They were very talkative. They wanted to explain and respond to each other very much. So we weren't able to get all of our questions asked. And this group was very engaged. They were all professionals in some kind of way. 6 of the 7 women had children from preschool up through beginning college. And they had a lot of opinions on the world and how things operated. The young people, maybe it's because we were meeting on campus and they had this guy who looked like one of their professors, but they provided a lot of short answers. And it took much longer for them to warm up and be talkative. The big takeaway from this group was how negative their view of the future is between climate change and the divisiveness in this country. They feel like the older generation has just failed. And they're very concerned that things are going to be much worse for them than it was for their parents. The Black voters, 6 of the 7 were voters. We had 1 who was not registered to vote. Very concerned about current economic issues, much more so than the other 2 groups. Very concerned about social issues, both current and future. And one of the interesting nuances there was, while most of them felt like they experienced racism in their lives, they just took that as a given. What bothered them was what it impacted their economic life and their healthcare. They're feeling like healthcare systems not attention to them because they're Black, or feeling that they had been passed over for promotion because they were Black. Another very interesting thing was, while this group was economically liberal, very strongly supporting raising the minimum wage and expanding Healthcare Act, were culturally diverse. They were split on issues of abortion and marijuana legalization. So a few graphs. So the first group, the white women, what is your concern for the future? Right off the bat, divisiveness and civic apathy. People just not being willing to engage, or if they do engage, they're doing it in the wrong way. And we saw this to a lesser extent with the other 2. We asked them about what would solve this divisiveness. And on the political side, there was a strong contingent that supported term limits, just thinking we need to have a bigger turnover in public officials. Maybe that would do better. And just wanting people to engage more in general. And we kept pressing on that. And finally what they said, well, we just hope the younger generation does better than us. The young folk in their lives have not been polarized yet, and they deal with each other, Black, white, Hispanic, much easier than the adults do. And so they're very hopeful that the young people may be able to move beyond some of the divisiveness that we see. On issues like healthcare, very nuanced view. General feeling that while 6 of the 7 in this group had healthcare, had health insurance through their employers, 1 did not. She's self-employed and it's just too expensive. And while 2 of them very specifically raised increasing healthcare access through like current program, nobody objected to that. It was very interesting. There were quite a few nods around the group. So even though this group was evenly split, 3 Democrat, 3 Republican, and 1 independent, across the board, they thought that everybody should have access to healthcare and that we need to improve the system. On crime, this is not personally threatened by crime, it on the news. And when we asked them what can be done about it, the first thing was dealing with mental health and then drug abuse. Very nuanced view. This was not, we need to lock them up. This was, we need to deal with the causes of crime. I think they understood that the 3-year-old did not say, I want to become a criminal when I grow up. Something happened as they grew up that led them in this situation. We need to figure that out. And then one of the issues that we had not planned to ask about but came up was parental leave. This group was across the board supportive of improving parental leave, including strong support for paternal leave and increased access to childcare. And it makes sense. These are people, 6 of the 7 were mothers, and they saw the impact. They personally understand the impact that this could have on improving their lives and the lives of the people around them. Going to the young adults, guns, it was the big issue that came up very strongly. Of course, this happened right after a couple of big mass shootings, but this is also the group that has had to live with lockdown drills in school, where schools, while they're in elementary and high school, they've got a plan for how do they deal with a school shooter situation. And you could see in their responses how this has had a traumatic effect on their lives. And so this is a really important issue to this group. Global warming and the political divisiveness, the economy, reproductive rights were all brought up as very important issues to this group. This group was overwhelmingly for a women's right to choose. But it was interesting on the solutions on divisiveness and economy. The big one was, well, let us do something about it. They'd given up on the older generation. They felt like the geriatrics in Congress should just get out of the way. They've had a long enough chance to do things, and they're just continuing to mess things up. When asked what would cause them to vote, several said they felt like it was their civic duty. This was something their parents had taught them. But they're also looking for people to inspire and somebody who will provide answers to these solutions. For the Black group, this was an interesting shift. What was their fear? It was social and moral decay. So in some ways, this is that fear of the future that we saw in the young adult group. But this group was also expressing concerns over things like the violence that they hear in rap music, the young people who are not working and not in school, the communal violence, i.e. just between friends and families. Religion came up much stronger with this group. Concerns about the negative influence of social media came up much stronger with this group. And one of the things we would like to test is this because a rural versus urban divide? Would we see a significant version among Black Americans in our urban areas versus our rural areas? This group was much more keyed in on the economy and how inflation is hurting them. And part of that is for this group, these are all wage earners, but several of them are in a situation where they're caring for elderly members of their family and younger members of their family. So they are carrying 3 generations, and they feel the stress very much so. We asked, is racism an issue in your life? And in the future, we will ask this of all how they view racism, but a couple of them said they haven't personally experienced racism, but they do see it influencing other people's lives. And this is where it was like we popped a balloon and stuff just started spilling out on this issue. And it was really interesting. We had a Black and a white person leading the group, but one of the participants in particular was talking to the white leader as if he was represented the white establishment. You need to do this. It was a fascinating dynamic within this group, but I think it was a success that we made it comfortable enough for them to speak out like this. And then what is the key issue that will get you to vote? The economy, again, dominated. And we saw the elder care issue come up here because of this issue of trying to care for their elderly parents or grandparents and the student debt issue. And then we had the one person who was not a registered voter who probably decided he wasn't going to vote. So the summary, what from this? Well, everyone was concerned about divisiveness and the failure of politicians to deal with real problems. There was a general concern about healthcare and social services in general, a more complex understanding of what public safety means and how we deal with crime than we had expected. And this negative view of the future, especially among the young people, also among our Black participants. And we're seeing this in public polling where 70% or higher of people feel like this country is moving in the wrong direction. And for these folks, it was very personal as well as the. So what's the synthesis from the study of both the first half of this presentation and the second half? One is the political ecosystem is structured to promote partisanship. I think we need to get past, well, if we just elect some better people, things will get better. No, that's not going to be enough. We've been trying that for a while. The structure is wrong, and too many people, politicians and pundits, and a whole bunch of others profit from partisanship. These systemic failures are promoting anxiety and fear, and this anxiety and fear then creates the opportunity for the kind of strong man, whether it's a fascist from the left or right, to get a lot of followers. And because when people are fearful, they want somebody to protect them. And especially when you've been taking apart the institutions that would protect public safety, healthcare, and these things that the economic safety net that have been gradually dismantled over the last 30 years. So there's a strong feeling that they want the system to change. The hopeful thing is that there is a lot of common ground on certain issues, on the economy, on healthcare, on the political system, not but on the political system. There is common ground that people want solutions that will make things better, and that people working in coalition have been finding this common ground. And so on the one hand, while many of the things that we heard from the focus groups were negative, the takeaways I have are very positive. So I'm going to pause here for questions and leave this slide up with these websites that I have provided. And so if somebody could help me out with any, either people want to type things into the chat or just speak up, and I will try to answer some questions.
Don't forget to unmute if you want to ask a question.
Okay, I'll ask a question, Bryan. This is Jackie. Can you hear me?
Yes.
What are your plans for next steps? Do you intend to do more focus groups?
So we are trying to share this information that we've developed with politicians, people running for office, because we think there's an opportunity for politicians to take the high road and talk about solutions, and that people will respond to that. And then for the next round, we are looking at doing some more issue-oriented focus groups, and we will, I hope we will have the energy to do a working class white focus group, because that's actually the largest voting bloc out there. And we need to understand where people are coming from. So we will do some of that, but right now we're just trying to coast through the elections, and then we'll regroup after that.
Thank you.
What else?
Hi, Bryan. Thank you for
Hi, Deidre.
sharing information. I just had a quick question. I was wondering if you're able to reveal with the African American focus group, were most of the people in that group over 45?
They were 30 to 50.
Okay,
So we had some people in the 30-year-olds, and we would like to have do a mixed race young adult, 18 to 29 group as well, because this group we're seeing in the polling is really getting cynical, and so they have this warring feelings of this feeling like they need to engage because it's their future and they want to try to make things better, versus an intense cynicism about the systems and the willingness of the people in power to listen to them. And so trying to identify how to support them in staying engaged in the political process will be very important.
has your group or organization considered having a focus group of white males, since that is those individuals who are primarily in positions of power in terms of politics?
We hadn't talked about it in that context. We thought of it as more of a working class one, of understanding, because there's been a lot of discussion about why working class voters are voting against their economic interest by supporting Republicans, but they are definitely voting for their identity interest. And so trying to tease out the difference there. As far as doing more of one that would be targeting leadership, we hadn't talked about that. That would be an interesting one. And I'm not sure we could get them to talk honestly, to be honest.
When you talk about a lot of common ground, is the common ground the fact that things are just so divisive, nobody's happy with that?
The common ground, what we've seen here and what we've also seen in some polling is that, and we've also started doing some interviews. And so we're specifically targeting the kind of independent to moderate Republican white voters for our individual interviews. And what we're seeing there is that there's support for improving healthcare access, for instance, but maybe not a top-down federal government. Maybe they want to see something run by states. On this deep feeling that the political system is not working and they're wanting answers, they just don't know what they are. And I think there's an opportunity for a lot of education and discussion on that. People understand the economic system is rigged against them, but they don't know what the answer to that is. And they're afraid of just top-down tax the rich people type of things. They want some other answers. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
And I should mention there's a general fear of climate change and the impact that that's going to have on their lives. And again, they're not sure. They just, it seems too complex. They don't understand it. what else?
Brian, we have something in the chat from
Okay.
Jenny. See that?
So we have not started sharing that. Well, actually, we have shared this with a couple of local elected officials, Republicans, because that's all we've got, except for maybe some hidden Republicans and Democrats in the cities. And they've been very thankful. They are trying to use this. And they've given us some feedback on how we have structured and asked the questions and presented the information. Again, you know, we've seen how people who have started out trying to claim being middle of the road or just moderately conservative have been pushed to the extreme by the electoral system and feeling like they have to do these things. And it's going to take some courage. And I think what's going to happen is that as we get closer to parity in the state legislature, I'm assuming that demographic and political shifts will give Democrats a few more votes in the state House and Senate. And if that trend continues and the Republicans look at the potential to lose power by the next census, 2030, that we will have a window to enact some political reforms that protect both parties, that actually protect the middle ground by getting independent redistricting. And one of the interesting things that did happen is overseas Georgia voters now get to use ranked choice voting. So we have our toe in the water on that one. And so we may be able to sell ranked choice voting for, say, local elections. It's just saving money. Why do we want to have primaries, elections, and then runoffs when we can do all of that in one election in these off years? So there's an opportunity to sell a couple of these things that will have incremental benefits over time.
Brian, are you through with the sharing?
Yeah,
Okay.
I'll stop that. Thank you.
More questions, y'all? Please feel free to ask.
And Carol, you were involved. If there's anything I missed that you want to put out there, feel free.
No, it's just been a real learning experience for me.
Mhm.
How did you let people know this was available to them?
So the recruiting people for the focus groups was a much bigger issue than we expected it to be. So we very specifically trying to recruit people who are not on the extremes. So we wanted to find people who are in the middle, like especially on that first one. So that was done. Basically, a couple of people went out and interviewed a whole bunch of people that they knew. And so there was, and we tried to recruit people who didn't know each other so they wouldn't be afraid of what they were going to share in that group, getting back within their social network. So that was for the white women one. On the young people one, again, we had a couple of people who went out and recruited out of their social networks. We tried phone banking for that one, and nobody returns phone calls. You know, it's just another sales pitch. And we did pay $25 for each participant, but we understand that many of the corporate ones, they do it online and they actually do massive, and they're paying $100 for each participant. So you can actually make a living participating in a bunch of focus groups. And then for the African-American one, again, we used one person who has a local nonprofit that does a lot of outreach with youth, African-American youth, to go reach out to people were connected to his organization. So that is something we still need to work on. But it was very difficult to put together a group that was polarized to begin with, people in the middle that also had our kind of demographic goals.
Thanks.
All right, so I think I've used up about all of the time, and I want to thank you all for the time to share this. And I just want to encourage people to check out those resources that I provided in the slideshow. They're excellent ones. And I think that we have an opportunity locally here in Carroll County to make a difference on a couple of these things because of the interesting mix of resources that we have in the community. Between the Southwire and Tanner, it draws in a lot of well-educated people and people with money who might be willing to invest in some long-term, making the long-term difference. And we have the university, which is a potential resource. And we have the community foundation. One of the things I've started talking with them about is doing a community indicators project here, because as you all know, if you can measure it, you can then do something about it. And so hear about what's the stock market doing or what the employment rate is as key numbers. And those drive our discussions. Well, what if we had a happiness index or a health index or a wealth index that we could use to talk about how things are going in our community? And so if anybody is interested in helping with that, please get in touch with me because we're going to start working on that soon. And I think this could be one of those things that changes things over time.
Bryan, thank you on behalf of Carroll County League of Women Voters. We really appreciate people like you coming forward and sharing with us because it informs us. Let me just take one more minute to say this is a very important voting year. Everybody knows that, and voting or us is us. So we're in need of poll workers. And so if you know of anybody who wants to be one, encourage them to contact the election office, excuse me, in Carroll County. I have a number for that if you want me to put it in the chat, or it's 770-830-5823. So if you know of anybody, or if any of you want to be poll workers, please contact them. I'm going to close up now if nobody else has anything. Thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you next month.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Bryan.
Bryan.
That was fabulous.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye.